discussion this morning. Those of you who were at the board meeting yesterday heard me talk about this already a little bit. I do believe that there's a fundamental shift happening within the global automotive supply chain. It's going to take time, but there is an increased focus on circularity. So the discussion with all those involved, all the stakeholders in the automotive supply chain is so important, and especially the collaborators between the automotive industry and the recycled materials community. So this discussion is a great start to that. And I really appreciate everyone being here, and especially our panelists. Now, it's particularly fitting that we're here in Detroit, which is the birthplace of automotive innovation. As our nation, especially as our nation prepares for its 250th anniversary. We've always been a country that invents, builds, and improves. And that spirit of innovation extends beyond designing great vehicles. It also includes finding smarter, more efficient ways to use materials that make them. Today, all of us in this room know that over 2/3 of a modern car is made from high-quality recycled materials. In fact, the automobile is one of the most recycled products, consumer products in the world, with up to 90, at least here in the U.S., with up to 95% of retired vehicles processed and reused each year. And this isn't just good for sustainability, it's good for manufacturing, supply chain resilience, and American competitiveness. So we believe, very importantly at ReMA, that the future of American manufacturing depends on stronger collaboration between across the entire materials value chain. And conversations like this one certainly help make this happen, make that happen, and moving forward. And so whether your interest is metals, plastics, electronics, batteries, or broader circularity trends, our discussion today will provide valuable insights into the future of materials and manufacturing. So I'm very grateful for the panelists that we have with us today and for all of you coming into Detroit. So we appreciate that very much. And with us today, we have Mark Bacchus, Senior Manager, Chemical and Materials Stewardship, Regulatory Affairs, and Environmental Sustainability, a long time, with Toyota North America. Thank you, Mark. Dan Bowerson, the Vice President of Energy and Environmental Policy with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Welcome. And Ellen Lee, Technical Leader, Advanced Polymer Technologies, Research and Advanced Engineering at Ford Motor Company. And of course, thank you to our moderator, Carrie Bliss, Principal Sustainability at Panelists. So thank you again for joining us, and I will turn this over now to Carrie to start the conversation.
Okay, Mike, but maybe it's better if I use this? Okay, there we go. We're great. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here. You guys are in for quite a treat. There's so much knowledge and experience. I've had the pleasure of seeing a couple of you speak before, and we want you to feel like this is an open discussion, a conversation between all of us. Our primary goal is really to build that collaboration, which requires us to be transparent, requires us to have these conversations and to have more of these conversations. So with that, we'll get started.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me, Robin, and the team. Really appreciate it. As Robin mentioned, I'm Dan Bowerson, Vice President for Energy and Environmental Policy, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. You for sure know the two iconic brands that are sitting next to me. You probably don't know who I represent. So we are the trade association of the light-duty vehicle industry. Our members include manufacturers that produce nearly all of the light-duty vehicles sold in the U.S. Two brands that you don't see up there, Tesla and ReMA, for just differences of issues, but we work very closely with them. We also have a number of tier 1 suppliers, including most of the major EV battery suppliers, autonomous vehicle startups, and we also now have EVgo, which is a charging company, so really representing the full value chain of the light-duty vehicle industry. My role on the energy and environment side ranges from emissions regulations to end-of-life stewardship and things like that, so that's why we're here today. And I echo the desire for partnership with this association. This is an area where we see a lot of growth and a lot of opportunity, and we're seeing our companies even ramp up. You'll hear Mark and Alan talk about that in terms of staffing for this type of discussion. My role on this panel is to be very high level, kind of give an overview of the light-duty vehicle industry. My two colleagues here will be able to answer all of your technical questions, so I'm happy to defer those, but we do welcome any questions you have. Just looking at production versus sales, you'll notice we're down from pre-COVID. We were about 17 million U.S. light-duty vehicle sales. We're down about 15.5 now. The one thing to note on this slide that you see here is the gap between production and sales has decreased. So we're seeing more North American production and more U.S. U.S. light-duty vehicle sales as well. And these slides will be sure to make sure they can be shared after. This is all actually from a report that we do on a quarterly basis. Light-duty vehicle sales for March of this year, when you look at by segment, you'll see the light-duty truck segment continue to grow and the sedan market continue to decrease year over year. When we look at gas prices to sales, you'll notice that going back from 2013, that light truck market has been a steady incline. We don't see that slowing down anytime soon. The question that we get a lot of times is, well, with gas prices rising, are we going to see now maybe a turn to sedans? It's too early to be honest to say if we're going to see that. Usually with high gas prices, it will take about a year before we see a difference in sales. So if gas prices remain high, we may see that start to decrease a little bit, but that will again take prolonged gas prices increase for us to see it change. So I'll spend just a few minutes as well talking about the EV market, or maybe what you've read in the papers, the lack of EV market lately in the U.S. So full year over year, we had about 1.5 million EV sales sold through March. This is the first time, what you'll notice on the graph, the first time that we've been tracking this, and we saw an actual contraction in EV sales for 2025. A lot of this, you'll see the spike there. There was a federal EV tax credit that was available through September of last year, so we saw a huge surge in sales and then a huge plummet immediately following that. It remains to be seen where this shakes out, but we kind of see this as, at least for now, water kind of finding its level for EV sales. We're still seeing increase. There's a lot of great products on the market and continuing to produce more and more electric vehicles. But without the tax credit, there's been a decline in EV sales. Model availability for electric vehicles, the largest segment we see is utility vehicles. So similar to the light trucks that we saw in the overall sales, utility vehicles, so that's your crossovers, your sport utility vehicles are the highest growing segment of electric vehicles. Through the first quarter of this year, there was 164 different EV models available for sale in the U.S. So this number has continued to increase. We'll be out with a new report for the second quarter, and we actually will, for the first time, see a slight decrease in EV models available, with some products being canceled or delayed. Just average transaction price. This is probably not news to anybody here, but average transaction price for a typical vehicle, whether electric or internal combustion engine, is over $50,000. EVs are about $5,000 more typically on average than light-duty vehicle. Now, that is slightly skewed because, as you're aware, there's a lot of luxury product in the electrified segment that's making that average a little higher, but still, this is putting it up in the price range for a number of typical U.S. vehicle buyers. And then lastly, I'll just note here that the biggest thing that we've seen as even plug-in electric hybrid vehicles and battery electric vehicles have increased. The highest growth that we've seen is actually traditional hybrids. My colleagues here have many on the market available today, so we're still seeing growth. So even with the contraction of pure electric vehicles, we are still seeing growth in traditional hybrid vehicles. And then last slide I think I have here is, so when we talk about EV sales, we're talking about new vehicle sales. These vehicles typically are on the road for 12 to 14 years. Total vehicles in operation that are electric is about 2.5% in the U.S. So even when we're at 10% of the new quarter vehicle sales being electric, the total market share is still just over 2.5%. And with that, I am happy to hand it over to Mark, who will kind of talk more of your specific interest, I assume. So.
Good, thanks, Dan. So Ellen and I agreed that we needed to do a good cop, bad cop, and I got stuck with the bad cop. So again, thank you to ReMA for having us here. The first thing I just want to mention is that we see this as an opportunity. We're at a sort of a fork in the road that we, as the auto sector, the OEMs and the supply chain, we all need to come together with all of you more. We need to come together and get closer with all of you, the recycling community, the shredders, the dismantlers. And so we hope that this is just the start of an expanding relationship between all of us. So thank you for tuning in. Yes, I got the cheer. Yeah, so I'm just gonna, reason why I say back cop is no one really likes regulation, but it's the reality, it's the truth. So we're gonna get you a set, sort of level set, and then Ellen's gonna give you some of the good news, some of the things that we're working on as a sector, and some of the other things that we're working on. But first, I think is some realities here. So the end of life of a vehicle. So really, there's quite a number of factors here that I won't get into. But I think Robin mentioned a lot of these points. Is that the vehicle is very circular. We realize that, and we're very dependent on many of you to get these materials. So that is one of the big reasons why we need to expand that relationship. So plastics typically is a bit of a tension point within this community and with regulators especially. So just kind of setting the tone. So we can see all the different plastics, and I think many of you are all familiar with this, but here is a sort of a ratio of where all the plastics are in the car, and they're there for a reason. We did a GM actually, I'll give them credit for this. They did a quick study, and they found rough on average, and this is back of the napkin, around 600 different kinds of plastics in an average car. And they're there for a reason, and I can get into that in a Q&A if it organically moves that way. But I always like to bust this out, and this is actually a good segue. But this is 49 CFR. If you're not familiar with 49 CFR, these are all the safety regulations that we have to comply with. And it's not that they're bad. We just literally had a good conversation about how a car got into a wreck, a Ford vehicle that got into a wreck, and all four of the kids were saved. They were fine. They walked away, no problem. And part of the reason is this, so they're here for a reason. But the fact that they're here, the fact that they exist, and then you add on top of that all the requirements for internal durability, like we all have different requirements for open and closed durability, or various durability requirements. We have assembly requirements. We can't have a car that's very difficult to put together. There's tons and tons of different requirements. So the reason we have so many plastics, there's about 15 different plastics just in this part alone. They all serve different purposes. Different plastics have different strengths and different weaknesses. So we have to use those variety of plastics. So we're going to remain dependent on your community to be able to dismantle, shred, separate that ASR, and so on. So that's one key point. So plastics are going to continue to be a priority for the auto sector because of the expansion into electrification. We need lightweight solutions and other things. So plastics are going to continue to be a challenge. So getting into some definitions, and these are the way we define these, by the way. This is not necessarily like an agreed upon regulatory definition, but again, we're just sort of setting the stage here of the various types of plastics. We've got standard plastics, engineering plastics, and foam. And these are just very basic categories. There's combinations, there's blends, you got tri-block, all kinds of different kinds of polymers that serve different purposes. We're going to spend the next 3 hours talking about every single one of those. No, but yeah, there's a lot there. And then in terms of how that sort of connects with all of you, and again, this is not, I realize this is preaching to the choir for the most part, but when we talk about regrind, PIR, and so on, and closed loop in particular, the reason why I'm putting these up here first, or we're putting these up here first, is this sets the stage for how regulations are being constructed that will affect all of you. So this is sort of background fodder that looks kind of boring at the beginning, but we can come back to these if we need to as we get into the regulatory details. So big picture view. All right, bad cop time. All right, big picture view. End of life vehicle regulations are expanding. There's a lot coming, guys. So we have to be ready as automakers. You guys have to be ready as the recyclers and the shredders and so on. But the ones that really are moving the needle, put in bold here, Mexican Circular Economy Law, which I'll talk about, the EU ELV directive, and also the Plastic Pollution Treaty. So all these I'll talk about very briefly. The pollution treaty, so I am the now the David Hasselhoff of Germany of the auto sector. So that second picture is me getting interviewed at the UN plastics treaty negotiations in Geneva by a German TV station. But basically what you can see here, there's a lot of passion around plastics pollution, and this is driving a lot of these regulations. So there's two big things that we're really struggling with, which is a desire for many countries to ban a bunch of plastic additives. And by the way, there's additives all throughout this piece of this component, and they all are very, very important for performance, whether that be safety, adhesion, or whatever, flammability, all kinds of things that they serve very, very distinct purposes, either for safety or for durability. And the other thing is polymer production caps. This would be a killer, right? If a lot of the NGOs want to cap polymer manufacturing, and so that there's no plastic being put into the ecosystem, well, that's going to affect us. So that's why we're involved. So one other thing I'll really mention briefly is the ELV challenge, Intelligent Vehicle Challenge in Europe. So I'm not going to go through every single little detail here. Obviously, there's a lot. But the one that I'll point to in the bottom left is the recycled content requirements that we are going to have to comply with. And honestly speaking, I think as I talked with Ellen and within our technical teams and other car makers, those numbers aren't that, they're going to be challenging, don't get me wrong. It's a really big first step. But I think we're going to achieve it. But what I think is going to be really important for you guys to take away is that big box in the middle. That big box in the middle is a big problem that we're looking to navigate right now and affects everybody in this room. And the reason why it's important is this effectively will mandate upon all of you to, number one, be certified in a certain way. You will have to have supply chain, you have to have traceability. We have to be able to say that we got X percent, because we can't satisfy that percent on the bottom unless we can prove through traceability that X percent came from post-consumer, which means it was after the use of a person, like a water bottle gets thrown into the blue bin, or a car part gets shredded or whatever. We have to prove that. And you guys are gonna have to tell us what percent you have ins and outs in all your processes. That's gonna be really difficult. And oh, by the way, they are expecting that there's a nationwide EPR law. They surprised, there is no nationwide EPR law. So we gotta figure that out. So that's gonna be a big challenge. And we can talk about that down the road. Mexico Circular Economy Law, I'm not gonna get too much into the weeds on here. Let's just say they're moving at blinding speed on this. They have no idea, they have a very vague idea what they're doing, but they're going at this with just absolutely every single cylinder running full slam and moving faster than industry is ready. So if you have presence in Mexico, get ready for this. And so they have their priorities. They're looking at certain things first, like the easy stuff like water bottles and things like that. But eventually they're going to move to the cars. And I know you guys, a lot of you heard about this yesterday in some of your conversations. But we're very nervous about this because this, if we're not careful with this could turn into an EU type of requirement that might be a little bit overburdensome and not realistic. So we're really keeping a close eye on this and working closely with the Mexican government to make sure that this is built in a way that's achievable. And we will definitely be having conversations with ReMA and many of the members of ReMA to make sure that this is being constructed in a cohesive way. Backing up, just really quick packaging. I know this doesn't affect a ton of you guys, but I think it does affect some of you. So again, this is expanding globally. There's a lot of push for us to take ownership of materials and components at end of life of everything, including packaging. And so that's expanding quickly. States, this is a good quick snapshot. And by the way, I think this will be available for all of you, so I don't think you need to take pictures or whatever unless you want to. But the states, you can see some states that have already passed laws, some that are actively pursuing laws. And this is problematic because take a look at this. We're not going to get into the weeds here, but they're all different. And it's all very difficult for us to, as car makers, and if anybody works in the space of selling any consumer product, you got to figure out how to comply with all of these. And we don't make a car or a packaging that's for California that's different than that for Oregon, right? They're all the same. So we have to figure out a way that we can have everything work together. So, and there's cost, right? Like we're looking at millions of dollars just in California alone every year that we're gonna have to pay, and every OEM is gonna have to pay. And yeah, so that's a big factor that we need to consider. Vehicle battery EPR in EU, this is already adopted. The biggest thing that I think that we'll take away from this is the top right, the recycled content. So we are going to be very, very dependent on the battery circularity community, the recyclers, to recover these materials, because in Europe, and by the way, this is getting expanded a lot, these states that are adopting state laws are mirroring what's happening in Europe. So it's not going to just be a Europe thing, it's going to be the US, Canada, and other jurisdictions. So we need those battery materials to come back to us so that we can meet these requirements. And then finally, a vehicle battery EPR policy. So you can see, as I mentioned, Colorado has recently passed a landmark law. New Jersey had a law, it was fairly light. It's not as huge of a problem, but the Colorado law will be challenging. And now California will be adopting a very similar law here, and we're expecting here in the next month or so. And it will be very similar to Colorado. The good news is we're working cohesively as an industry to educate lawmakers and to centralize that. So hopefully we won't have a situation where we've got 50 different ways of doing things in the U.S. We're hoping to have a very narrow set of policies when it comes to battery end of life. So we've done a pretty good job as an industry of centralizing that. Okay, so last slide, I think is my last slide that I'll cover. So there's a lot of other bad news that is affecting circularity that I think is worth raising. So first is vehicle cost, right? Dan spoke about this a bit. So we're getting a lot of pressure in the auto sector about why our vehicles are so expensive. Well, there's reasons for that. I mentioned, the safety requirements and all these other things, but that's a whole story that I'm sure Dan would love to get into. But it is a factor, right? And when we did a survey within Toyota, and I can guarantee it'll be the same with other OEMs, we did a survey of our customers and asked them, are you willing to pay more for a vehicle with recycled content? 2% said yes. Right? So that means we have to absorb that cost, and eventually, we have to raise our vehicle price. So that gives you an example of the environment that the OEMs are facing. Electrification shift, Dan mentioned, we're still slowly moving in that direction. Vehicles are heavier, they're more expensive, as Dan mentioned, so we have to manage that. Global political tension, tariffs, trade uncertainty, right? We've got less global efficiencies because of that we might have to face. So we as global automakers, Toyota makes 80% of what we sell here, we make here, but we're a very global company. We get components that are centralized in one place and they're sent all over the world. But when you get tariffs, that really throws things off, right? Like that's making almost like a hoarding situation where we gotta really centralize certain things, and that creates a lot of inefficiency. So that's gonna affect our circularity efforts as well. Supply chain vulnerabilities, natural disasters, right? That's going up. So all the oil areas in Texas, Louisiana, more and more bigger, heavier hurricanes. A lot of times we're getting issues where our supply chain has to stop because of some natural disaster. Increased environmental complexity. We from 50 years ago, everyone talked about these nickel and dime environmental challenges, and those were fairly easy. They were challenging, but we were able to get to address them. But now we've got competing environmental challenges. When you talk about circularity, oftentimes circularity is in competition with carbon. And by the way, I don't know if you recognize this, the auto sector has a carbon challenge, right? Like we're working on reducing carbon. So if we have solutions that increase carbon or aren't trying to reduce carbon footprint, that's a problem. So we have to address those as well. So that's all the bad news. Now you get all the good news.
Thanks for setting me up that way. As Robin said, I'm Helen. I'm from Ford Motor Company. I've been with Ford for almost 28 years and have had the good fortune of most of that time working in sustainability and circularity, which is a huge passion of mine. And part of the reason is because it's an integral part of the Ford DNA. So many of you may know, but some of you may not, that Henry Ford himself was working in circularity way back in the beginning of the company, and for many of the reasons that we've already talked about here. So he once said that the farmer and the car maker each produces what the other needs. And I would say the same is true for the recyclers and the car maker, who each produce what the other needs. And part of that, that symbiotic relationship is what really drives circularity. So I'm really excited to be here to talk to you all and start the conversation. And thank you so much, Robin and Cheryl and Paul, for having us here today to talk about it. So not all good news yet, because I'm going to present some of the challenges that we have to do that, but then I will hopefully talk about some of the things that all of the automakers are doing to try to address these challenges and hopefully work together with the recycling industry. So I'm sure many of you are aware of what the mobility or the automotive product life cycle looks like. It's pretty complicated, but we start with the raw materials. They go through a certain level of processing, and then we get our parts that assemble into the vehicle. And then at the end of life for that vehicle, there's disassembly, shredding, etc. And then here's where we try to recover as much as we can from the vehicle. So some of the challenges are that if, I know it's hard to see, but when you get a copy of these slides, there is a, you'll see a chart in the bottom right corner here that delineates kind of the breakup of different types of plastics that are in that ASR stream. And each of those bars represents ASR from a different shredder. Right, so you see a ton of different types of plastics that Mark kind of highlighted before, and then you also see that the mix changes from shredder to shredder, and it depends a lot on what the input is, because we know that not all ASR is from automobiles. Right? There is a mix of things that go into the shredder. So that's one of the things that makes this so challenging. Because we're also transitioning towards more EVs, I show a similar but a little bit different battery material life cycle as well. And you will see that essentially the same. Start with some raw materials, those get processed and then put into a vehicle. And at the end of life, we're trying as hard as we can to recover those materials, which are very critical and expensive and valuable to put back, but with a certain level of processing that's needed as well. So Mark mentioned a little bit, we focused a lot on recycling, but when you talk about circularity, there are different drivers that I'll touch on in a moment that may sometimes be in conflict with one another, and one of those is the carbon footprint. And so this just kind of shows the trend towards propulsion choices from ICE vehicles to hybrids to full electric vehicles. We have a huge carbon footprint that comes from the battery. So anything that we can do to recover those materials and reduce the level of processing for those materials will help us to reduce carbon. And you'll notice that when we talk about the materials that go into those vehicles, there is somewhat of a shift of the types of plastics and other materials that will be used in the vehicle. And these, because the impaired life cycle footprint decreases from electricity usage for those vehicles, the proportion of carbon coming from the materials now has a bigger share. So we have to be more and more careful about the selection of those materials as we're balancing recycled content with end of life, recyclability with carbon. But recycling is a really great source of critical materials. So this shows for the battery, one of the big drivers for recapturing because you have to do so much less processing of those raw materials, they're already here. We don't have to import them from other areas. We have a significantly reduced cost. So likewise, I'm going to bring up Henry Ford again, and some of you may be aware that he was doing this type of thing with the drivers at his time that are very similar to what's happening today. So when he received components for vehicles in crate, once he assembled those components onto the vehicle, he took the wood from the crate and repurposed them for floorboards in the vehicles. And he didn't do it for environmental sustainability, per se. It was because it made sense, it reduced costs, it improved the efficiency. At the same time, during the war, there was a shortage of natural rubber for tires. And some of you may know that he spent a lot of time looking at incorporating renewable content from the fields in Dearborn into the vehicle. And he planted dandelions because he was able to take the latex from the dandelions and make that into a natural rubber. So we're seeing a lot of the same drivers here, but we can apply them to our modern day vehicles. So here are some of the drivers that I'm talking about. Recycled content, we have these external regulatory forces that are saying how much recycled content we need to put into our vehicles. Of course, we also have regulations that tell us how much we need to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions from the full vehicle life cycle to get to carbon neutrality, and of course the end-of-life recyclability of all of the materials that we put into the vehicles we need to meet as well. And so these can translate directly to targets that car automakers can have to ensure that we meet all of these goals. So Mark talked a little bit about the EU end-of-life vehicle regulation. There are similar regulations or recommendations that are more voluntary in Japan, not on this chart, but he also talked about some of the upcoming regulatory actions in Mexico. So why are we talking so much about other countries' regulations? And it's because we are all impacted by this. We're global companies. We do sell vehicles in these other regions as well. And sometimes we're manufacturing them in those regions, but sometimes we do export our vehicles into those regions. So we do have to follow the regulations from those. And you'll also note, well, I'll also note that automakers are seeing more of a pull from consumers to include more sustainable content. Even though they may not want to pay for it, they kind of expect it to be in the vehicles. And so we have this big challenge of trying to implement that at cost parity. So here are the types of things that OEMs are doing today. We are working on developing sustainable technologies in all areas and implementing them where we can. Things like working hand-in-hand with material suppliers on new chemistries, some level of chemical recycling, and also capturing carbon dioxide as a feedstock in some of these materials as well. From the converter and molder side, we have a lot of interest in how we reduce the carbon footprint in the manufacturing processes themselves, and we work on formulations that improve efficiency. For part suppliers, design for disassembly is something that we're working very closely on, because if we may not be able to reduce this component to a single material, but in some cases, some multi-material components can be reduced into at least a single family of parts, and that's one of the things that we're doing to ease design for recyclability. And then for dismantlers and recyclers, we are trying to collaborate more closely to understand what can be done to improve recovery, sortation, and separation, because we do have certain requirements that we have to follow for the quality of those parts, the performance of those materials that we put into our parts. Another thing that we have been implementing recently and is really driven by these upcoming regulations is tracking. We need to be able to get a baseline and understand what we're putting into our vehicles on a percentage-wise basis before we can set targets for how do we get to the requirements from those regulations. And a lot of this work we're doing with pre-competitive this is a challenge for the tech industry. So as I mentioned, these are the types of technologies that we're looking at, and kind of a rough timeline of when we expect to be able to implement them into our vehicles. So finally, I'm just going to end with a slide which is an example of some of the pre-competitive work that we're doing. One really focuses on closed loop content. So again, for us, closed loop means to take recycled content from vehicle parts and then put them back into vehicle parts. It doesn't have to be the same part, but it does have to come from the vehicle. And so because there are specific requirements driven by the EU end-of-life regulation, this is one area that we know that we need to focus on. So that's one project. And then the other kind of tackles the other end of the spectrum where we're looking at if we can use chemical recycling as a way to maybe address the challenge of separating different types of plastics in ASR. And some of the things that are important there are certain additives that have poison the process as well. So that's one of the other projects that we're working on. So I'll just end with saying, we would love to hear more about what's possible to get a lot more involved collaboratively because we each need what the other produces.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's great. So we have plenty of time for your questions. I'll just start us off with a couple of things that popped up while you were speaking today. I'll start with Mark. So we talked about the EU regulation or some of these regulations. Explain how that really impacts what's being manufactured here in the U.S. So there's a lot of talk about it, but how is it, are you going to have different models of cars that you're making here in the U.S. versus what you're making over there versus export? Will it change the way you export?
Sure. Yeah. No, I love that question because it really points to sort of the core messaging that we have with governments, either local or in Europe. And that is, we operate, for the most part, and I kind of touched on this earlier, but we operate generally on a global scale. Like the Corolla that's sold here is the same Corolla that's sold in Europe that's sold everywhere else. So because Europe is such a foundational and such a large market, by them being so aggressive, that by default drives us to have to fall into that swim lane, into their regulation. And so, as you could tell from that whole myriad of requirements, much of that's going to cascade to not just automakers like us, but all of you guys as well, right? So we're going to have to come to you and say, how are you complying with X, Y, Z? Because we got to get a vehicle that has X percent of closed loop that Ellen was mentioning, and we got to prove it to the European government to export to Europe, right? And by the way, the current administration is really prioritizing, keeping materials here in the United States for national security reasons, but that doesn't prevent Europe from saying, well, you can't sell this car without X, Y, Z requirement, right? So we can do all we want to keep those materials local, but if we can't prove them that we're meeting the requirements, then it looks like we're not selling to Europe, and that does not help our industry, it doesn't help your industry, because the healthier we are as a sector with the ends, the healthier you guys are as well.
Thank you. That's important. So I love the stories about Ford, and we would call that triple bottom line thinking, and we feel very similarly at Panelists, having been around almost as long as Ford, for 120 years now. It's so important that we don't lose sight of balancing what's good for the environment. It still has to be economically viable. If it's not economically viable, then none of us stay in business, right? So these things have to stay in balance. It gets challenging when we start to see the plastics coming out. Most of this audience are experts in the metals. Some of us know some things about plastic. Why are plastics becoming, this is really your specialty. Why do you see plastics continuing to evolve, continuing to be used more and more in the cars, even though the cars are getting heavier? They're still getting lighter. How does that work?
Right, yeah. I think the use of plastics is increasing because they have unique performance that you can't get from other types of materials. So we need to try to make them lighter, to be able to extend the range, to improve fuel economy, all of those aspects, but we still need them to perform to these safety requirements. We need them to perform to additional requirements that we have with electric vehicles now. And one of those, like we need to balance the fire protection, right? So a lot of things, but at the same time have good insulation, right? Both from thermal transfer as well as electrical. So, something that's really good at doing that is plastics, which metals are not quite as good for electrical and thermal insulation. And so they have their place, and we need to kind of balance and really engineer those materials. Now that said, because we need to have them perform these functions and to pass all of our safety, fire, performance requirements, some of those make them much harder to recycle, right? Like we often need to look to multi-material components. So the bottom line is we expect a lot of our vehicles and a lot of that function we get from plastic materials.
So you actually mentioned this, Mark, but I'm going to ask the question to Dan because I think it's your expertise. You had mentioned that there will be some sort of governing body for certification that might even impact the shredders or recyclers here in the States. Do we have any sense yet of who those certification bodies are? Who are we talking about? Is this like ISO certification, or how is that going to work?
Still being worked out. Mark can certainly answer that probably better than I, but still being worked out. But yeah, your expectation of ISO or UL or SAE or something along those standard development organization is likely the certification body that we would expect.
Good. And is there a particular place that we should be watching for anything new that comes out about that? Like, how do you get the latest information about some of these changes?
Mark or Ellen, call me. No, go on, Mark. You probably.
No, we monitor. I'm sure every OEM does this, but we monitor all the key, legislative and regulatory sites, and we have aggregating, services that help us, separate the wheat from the chaff and really focus on what the key announcements are. But yeah. So frankly, the big thing that we find is there's a lot of regulation, a lot of legislation that's out there, but you got to get that information to the right people to understand it and not give them a huge stack of documents and say, hey, is this a big deal? So you have to have a person that is able to at least narrow it down to a couple of key messages and then involve the technical people within your staff to say, okay, I don't understand, is this a problem or not? And then if it is a problem, then we would gather that and pass it to Dan to help, communicate those concerns with a particular government. In the case of the EU, for example, though, we would work, either with our partner associations in Europe, ASEA, or we would work with, for example, U.S. Trade Office or a variety of other American governments that could push against that in Europe, for example.
Right. Well, I don't want to take up all the time. I'm sure some of you have some questions. I have more I can ask, but if you'd like a question, raise your hand and they'll bring a mic to you.
Hi, I'm Jason Brunner. I have a small retail yard in Pennsylvania. My question is, we start talking about some of the certifications and stuff that may come down the pike for automobile recycling. Is, in my operation, we get many different sources of iron, of plastic, of aluminum, etc. Are we going to have to be keeping the vehicular scrap separate from the other streams of scrap in order to comply with these potential certifications that are going to come our way?
Yeah, I think probably the quick answer is yes. So far, that's our early indication. Is that there will be some traceability requirements. There's minimum ferrous and non-ferrous, meaning iron or aluminum type of materials, and there's also requirements for plastics and other things. So, but the key word that Ellen mentioned was the closed loop part, right? So that means you got to go, for example, bumpers is an easy example. We got to go and take a bumper and make it into another bumper. Right? So that it doesn't have to be a bumper. It could be, yeah, it could be an interior trim piece or whatever. Like basically like a car part to a bumper. Put it that way. Thank you for that. But yeah, so there will be some need for that to. I wouldn't say you necessarily would have to completely separate it and adjust it. You know, make incredible adjustments to your process flow. But there will need to be some element of traceability. That say, for example, you put in 20 Toyota cars, 20 Ford cars, and you've got X percent of that as refrigerators, appliances, and other things. There's going to need to be some degree of traceability in order to comply with the requirements.
Yeah, so I would say that it doesn't have to be separated. We just need to be able to understand what fraction is in there that can be traced in a way that can be audited. But I will add that we don't know yet exactly what is going to be required of the recyclers from the EU end of life regulation. They have just said that they want some level of certification, but the details outside of the EU are not yet known.
Yes. Regulations, they're starting. They should have regulations in the next year or so, and we're going to be working closely with them to help sculpt that.
I think that what you're also going to find is it's relative to who you're selling to, right? Are you selling that component to somebody who's going to compound it that will eventually make its way back into a car, or are you selling it just to a basic foundry that doesn't necessarily need to make those requirements? So it really will depend, but I think starting to figure out how you're going to track and gather that data, it's never too early to have that information, right? Because you'll figure out, because we're scrappy, we know how to market things, right? So if you can have that information, there's a value to that. So start working on it now.
I've got a follow-up question, if I could. Actually, serious follow-up questions, but I'll try to keep it concise. The requirements for plastics are different than the requirements for metals in the E-regs. And I think in some ways it's clearer on the plastics than it is on the metals. So there's certainly the traceability requirement for plastics. Does the traceability requirement apply to the metals? So, and as well as is there a closed loop requirement for metals recycled content, or is it only open loop?
My memory is that it's only for the plastics is the closed loop, I believe. Is that what it is? I'm not sure.
Well,
I have to study it.
But I don't know that there's even targets yet for metals. They have just kind of alluded to
Kept it at the same.
that there will be requirements. So it may be included.
Because that might affect also separation requirements. And then the other thing is just a request really, and a general question, which is as we move towards a need for possible certification and traceability, I assume they're going to be somehow integrated. But that's something that as that develops, we'd love to work with you on so that there aren't independent systems that start competing against each other or inconsistent.
Yeah.
So love to sit down with you and figure out how to do this in a way that works practically for the industry.
Agreed.
Thank you. Again, fascinating traceability. So having done Repurpose Season 3 at Toyota, Troy, Missouri, so now I'm going back to right next door is your own foundry owned by Toyota Toyota Tusho, basically owned by Toyota. So that operation provides the molten aluminum to make the cylinder heads. Now, who's going to be required on traceability? Is it Toyota, or is it most the foundry, or is most going to have to get it certified from the people they buy from, and isn't that be a potential disruption to the supply chain to get you the raw materials you need to make those cylinder heads?
Right. Yeah. I think it's really going to depend on how the regulations are built, as Alan mentioned, but the early indications are that basically think of it like go back to the old when you're in college, the mass balances, the ins and outs. So let's say you're bringing in 100 vehicles a day, and you're going to have that ratio compared to appliances and other things. So you're just going to literally have to measure ins and outs, and every single kind of recycling has to do this, whether it's a dismantle our shredder, even the folks doing advanced recycling, they're gonna have to do the same. They're gonna have to be able to say, I got X% from post-consumer, I got Y% as post-industrial. Some of that could go to the water bottles, but some of that we can't use because of regulation, for example. We can use some of it, but we can't count it to our closing percent, for example.
But I think there will need to be traceability from every partner in that chain.
Exactly.
We'll need to point to something to say they have shown that that's the amount that is what they're claiming.
And we're, based on the way the legislation is written, we're gonna have to come to all of you and get your numbers, get your certifications and all of that in order to get the COC from Europe. So if we, in order to get compliance, certification of compliance approval, we have to provide that evidence. So that would be another interesting adventure. So again, to Robin's point, we have to centralize this and standardize it so everyone's talking the same language, so that when we get all that from you, it's all one voice, it's all one language, so that we're not having to interpret, different things from different folks.
Scott Miller, General Counsel for Sims Metal. We have others in the United States, and also I'm a co-chair of the Shredder Committee, which is following this. Be given me and I think our committee food for thought for probably the next 3 years. The way I'm trying to organize all this in my mind is separating out, to Robert's point, metals. What do we have to plan for that? And then the whole issue of plastics. Right now, there's almost no plastic recycling in the shredding world. I'm not aware of any actually in the United States. So I'm not sure how much today we can do. We would absolutely love to be able to recycle the plastics. I can say as a company and as an industry, we've tried for years to make it work, and there are many obstacles. We solved the regulatory obstacle 12, 15 years ago, but we still have the commercial and the technical obstacles. We tried, we couldn't produce at tremendous use of resources the type of plastic that would qualify for any use in automobiles. So I don't know if plastics from ASR is feasible now or when it will be feasible. And if you take it out, then what's left of what we have to worry about today versus 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years in terms of what the metal shredding industry looks like and what we have to prepare for. It's really hard to plan. And this gives us a framework. And then what I'm trying to figure out in my mind is how much of it is affected by what's going on in the EU today, 5 years, 3 years, 5 years, versus what we have to focus on in terms of prioritizing the issue for preparing for what the metal shredding industry. We even use the word metal shredding. We don't talk about metals and plastic shredding. But we have to think about how this all fits together in terms of the time frame, the obstacles, and all this. So it's more of a general comment, and it's really trying to organize how this all fits together. It was kind of laid out, I guess, the last 2 meetings at Rafa. And we're coming to grips with it, but we want to put it in perspective that we can focus on in terms of where it sits in our line of priorities. It's hard to tell, but it's certainly raising a lot of good questions. So thank you.
That was really well said. I have my own follow-up on that particular one. Talk to us a little bit about the cycle of putting a new material into a vehicle, right? We've had 21 automotive approvals for plastics at Panelists, so I know a little bit about that struggle, but I'm not sure everyone here understands just what is involved. When you start planning a new vehicle or a new material in an existing, what does that time frame look like? Probably similar for both of you. Yeah.
So the time frame really depends a lot on the source of the material. So we have suppliers that are qualified that may offer a new material. We understand their feedstock and how reliable a supplier they are. We know their capacity, so that may not take quite as long as a new supplier, especially if it's like a startup or something, right? Then there's questions about capacity and the repeatability of the materials. But in general, it can take quite a long time. Even if they start with offering a material that passes one of our material specifications. So our specifications will lay out what the mechanical properties need to be, what the durability needs to be, all sorts of processability, everything about that material. submit samples of their materials to show that it passes all of the requirements of that material specification in order to qualify for the specification from either 3 to 6 lots of materials, depending on the type of material the supplier is, etc. And it has to be done like a battery of tests with an outside testing lab, just to make sure everything is on the up and up. Once that's done, then that material needs to be processed into a component, and then that component has to go through a full level of validation for whatever the function is. And that will depend on what the function of the part is as well. That part, if it used the same material specification, and you're just switching to a new specification, that will be the quickest way to get through that whole process. Now, if you're proposing to change the material or the design to something new, then you may have additional tests that need to be done. If it requires high impact testing for your crash or something like that. So the whole process can take years.
Yeah. So like best case scenario, what's the fastest you've seen it? If you had to make a guess. I won't hold you to it. It's okay.
It depends on the application.
I know, it does.
Yeah. Which I think in context to that, I think to help answer that is that, just to build that, because that is exactly right. And what you're finding, I think, is important for you guys to recognize is that, the auto sector dealing with so many issues like that they have to meet, they're starting with knowing that mechanical recycle is fairly easy to access, but the downside is it's highly variable, right? So there's not a whole lot of appetite to take a airbag material. I don't want to be that customer that gets that 10% chance that this airbag is not going to perform right? So we're not going to be using recycled materials for airbags in the near future, or for very highly safety sensitive parts. You need consistent component by component. Every component you have an expectation of performance throughout time. So yeah, and that development will exponentially increase on those scenarios. So like if it's just a battery tray or something tucked in the luggage area, that timeline can be a year or so to get all that development approved and testing all done. But when you're talking something fundamental like airbags and the instrument panel, the doors, the seats, those things that are very exposed to the consumer, those take years and years and years of validation, right? You gotta really prove to yourself that, this set of incoming material that's now going to have some variability is going to meet every requirement for every vehicle, that the government requires.
Even something like a rubber that goes inside your cup holder, for example, to keep your coffee cup from moving around. It's not a safety critical part, but it is something that the customer sees and can be very picky about. And so even passing all of the appearance requirements for that, when you change from material to material, especially when you start talking about mechanically recycled content, can take much longer than you would think it would.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Go ahead, if you have a question.
Sure. Hi, I'm Chris Cadell. I am a consultant and I work with Nucor and the David Joseph Company. First, I want to thank you for coming here today. It's really important that we understand what our customers are dealing with in the recycled world and also the global issues. We're not always sure what happens to Europe will spread to the U.S. They have some ideas that are great. They have some ideas that are a little bit wild and they never make it over here. And sometimes that's a good thing. But it's really important that we have these discussions. I mean, many of us in this room have worked with the auto industry over a long period of time, even back when we were trying to convince you to continue to use metal gas tanks back in the day when it switched to plastic. But the more we understand what your needs are, the better we can serve. And working together, particularly on tricky issues like traceability, because it just doesn't go from A to B. A lot of times it goes from A, and then some goes to B, C, D, E, and then it goes further down the chain. Our input into how that is designed will make it easier for you to get the certifications you need to be able to export those vehicles to a different market. Mark, I was disappointed to hear that only 2% of your customers are willing to pay more for recycled materials. And Ellen, but they expect it.
Yeah.
So that's a dilemma we face in the steel industry. We can make zero net carbon steel, but our customers going to pay for it, right? But they expect it. So there's all those challenges we face together. But I think if we could continue this dialogue between the recycling industry, trade association, your trade association, I know there's a lot of stuff going on, customer to customer, but the way trade associations can get things done so that we have practical requirements that we can meet, that meet your needs, that don't totally destroy our operations, I think that could be a win-win in an area that's uncertain right now. Like Scott mentioned, where do we invest? Where do we put the money? We got to have a sense as to what's coming and how we can adapt to that. But thank you for coming.
Certainty.
One thing maybe if I could just add, I can appreciate all your comments and couldn't agree more. I think there is a great opportunity for more collaboration between the associations, and Rob and I have talked about that already, and opportunities there. You know, the one thing we've been working closer with this industry when I can say honestly, it's not like we're advocating for what the EU put into place, maybe even very contrary, but when we're advocating in the States with the federal government, you know, we can talk very deeply about the automotive sector. We get way over our skis when we start talking about the recycling industry, right? So opportunities there to collaborate and bring you all into those conversations, to have your own perspective instead of the auto industry trying to talk, you know, for this industry. So appreciate those comments and certainly opportunity.
How important is it that you're having those conversations with legislators at the state and federal levels?
It's critically important. They don't always listen, but it's critically important. We have a very robust state affairs team. I mean, we actually have contract lobbyists in all 50 states. And my colleague who runs our state affairs department says, you know, you have to go in talking to state legislators like we're in third grade. Like it's that level that you've got to actually, there's got to be the time and dedication to kind of teach them, you know, what the issue is, because it's very simple for them to hear from one sector or one constituent and say this is what we need to do, but the ramifications are obviously the consequences of that.
There's so many unintended consequences
So many.
that they do not understand. I mean, not all of us probably have different perspectives. That's all important as part of the conversation, let alone you go to the legislator.
I think what he pointed to that is this plastics treaty, right? A lot of the plastics treaty is targeted at single-use plastics.
Yes.
Because they want to get rid of, like, the NGOs are really making a lot of noise with that. But our needs for plastics are very different. We need them to be durable. We're not using them once. We're using them for 20 years or longer, right, in our vehicles. And they're performing critical functions. And so there are unintended consequences of governments like pushing really hard to reduce to cap the plastics production, because even if they are trying to reduce single-use plastics, they're impacting us.
Very well said. I know we have more questions. Who has the microphone? Okay, great. Thank you. Your boss.
I don't know. Okay. I want to thank you all for coming. My name is Mark Weintraub. I'm the General Counsel of the Reserve Management Group, primarily on the metal side of the business, but we also have operations that purchase ASR, extract even more metal out of that. But my question is sort of multi-part and not necessarily related. Where do composite materials fit into this scheme? And is there an appetite amongst the OEMs to help with identification of the variable alloys that are used in the cars, aluminum and different plastics, identifying those, assisting in this whole circularity process? And lastly, I would think that on the advocacy side of things, it might be beneficial when you go to the third grade class to talk to the legislators that you close that loop and you go in together for those shared issues so that they can maybe have that much more understanding.
Yeah, agree with your thoughts. I'm trying to think. What was this middle question? Like, say that again.
About
identification of the variable alloys that are used.
Oh, you mentioned, yeah, you
To help us
mentioned
separate.
Yeah. So yeah, first comment I think is I think as an industry have established a standard of stamping in the back of components. In fact, you'll see it, in the plastic itself. It'll tell you what it's made of. We use ISO for all the plastics and things like that. That doesn't mean it couldn't be better. There are efforts in Europe, for example, of something called a digital product passport that is going to require that we offer a QR code, and a customer can scan this QR code and it'll say what it's made of. So I think there will be cascading benefits to all of you for those requirements as they're figured out, and that will be able to help say like, okay, this component is this material, this component is that material. And then as far as SMC and composites, those are equally important to the auto sector. There's a lot of applications with all the automakers with big, huge components that are really great for lightweighting, and we're going to continue to rely on them to serve that function. So we're going to need to have inputs from various companies like yourselves to help continue to serve those suppliers that can give us those parts.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of trade-offs to consider when we talk about materials, because as I said, we need them to perform certain functions, and more we're going to composites, specifically thermoset composites, which not really be mechanically recycled at the end of life. So we need to understand what the trade-offs are between end of life, recycled content. We can still put recycled content into them in some cases, and then the CO2 footprint. So if they can help to reduce the weight of the vehicle, then we help from the carbon that part. So I think it really, you kind of need to do that trade-off analysis to understand where and how to use them. And then we're also always looking at new technologies and materials that can serve that purpose, but then have improvements in end-of-life options and for carbon footprint.
Question. Hello? So I introduced myself to you earlier. First of all, thank you all for being here. This is absolutely fabulous. But I have a challenge for Mark and Ellen. So as we are so happy to have you here, we also have some experts in our audience about recycling. So my challenge to you is, what questions do you have that maybe someone of us could answer for you about our side of the business?
I mean, I have to put some thought towards that, but yeah, I mean, one thing I think is important that is, we talked about it earlier, which is having one voice and working together with leadership at ReMA to come up with what you think is the best approach for certain things. All the traceability stuff and all these different things, and then enabling them to work with our government so that they can engage European government in partnership with the Auto Association to help figure out like a path forward. That's going to be one thing. So I would challenge that's one question I have for you guys is, how do we do that? Do we do that through ReMA? Do we do that because ARA is a part of this equation as well? There's other elements along the supply chain, so we have to figure something out there. So I would challenge you guys and ask you guys, how do we do that?
I think for us, more of a question of what is possible with the recycling community or ecosystem. I'm going to refer to this slide up here. We all know that one of the big challenges of recovering end-of-life plastics is ASR. Like, all of the different types of plastics that are mixed together, we need to separate them and to a quality level that will pass all of our specifications and repeatable performance of the materials. So one of these projects is focused on, can we collect end-of-life components from elsewhere, like before they, like not from the end-of-life vehicle per se, from dismantling, but like from collision centers, etc., so that we have a fewer number of plastic parts that go into the shredder. Like, how realistic is that type of supply chain or that? Yeah, and because we know that it's going to be really complicated to ship, big bulky components everywhere. No one wants to ship a bunch of air, right? So there is an efficiency to shredding it all up together, right? Instead of dismantling. So I think it would be great to have good conversations about what is possible, what is not possible, so that we can kind of look at those trade-offs to make it work for both parties across the supply chain.
I just want to follow up with that. We're fortunate because I think we have, I was trying to calculate in my head, probably easily more than 80% of shredders throughout the country are represented in this room, maybe even a higher percentage. And if it's helpful at any point to bring the shredders in particular together into a room for a specific period of time with all of you, to ask questions, to perhaps look for partners for research. I know already you're doing work with Panelists, with Omni, and with a number of other members here, but if it's helpful to do that at any point, we're happy to facilitate that. So just let us know. And I'd also mention we just have a couple of other people in the room I want to make sure everyone's aware of. We've got representatives from Stellantis here as well. Frederic Gravel, and I apologize for Frederick if I pronounced your, and Mel Thomas, we both. Oh, Willie, I'm sorry. Willie is here. I apologize. Okay, totally messed that up. So, just if you could each raise your hands and say hello, we'd appreciate it. So thank you both for being here. And we also have Cindy Barrera Martinez. Yes, thank you. With Ford also here, and then Lynn Wendt from Idaho National Labs. I don't know if she's in the room. Oh, great. Okay, good. Thank you, Lynn. And a number of these folks are also going to be at our electronics meeting, our plastics meeting, and possibly in shredders. So we are going to have representatives, not just here now, but later. Just a question.
Hi, thank you. Julie Darby with BASF, the Environmental Catalysts and Metal Services Division. So something that you guys talked about was plastics, I think, predominantly, but something that we're working on is the rare earths in the permanent magnets. So with that in mind, I guess what's the single biggest barrier that you're seeing to creating kind of a viable closed loop process for recycling of that material within the automakers, and what I guess needs to change to implement that as we start to collect that material to try and put it in a closed loop to get it back to you guys?
Are you talking about specifically rare earths and magnets?
Sorry, yeah, rare earth in the permanent magnets in EV and hybrid versions. So we're currently on R&D working to collect for that, and we know obviously the global supply is pretty much 70% outside of the U.S. And again, above ground supply even being less. So kind of wanting to see your view on what that's going to take for you guys to be looking to recycle that. Right now, we're taking whole motors, and it's a very tedious process to remove. So just wanted to get your thoughts on what that looks like to you and how much of importance it really is.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. So the auto sector, all OEMs are really leaning into the design for recycle concept that Ellen already sort of touched on, and that includes batteries and other components that have these critical minerals. And by the way, we're getting a lot of pressure from the government to do that, exactly what you're saying, to say, we don't want to be dependent on China and all these other countries for these rare earths. We got them here already. Let's do what we can with these existing supply chains and their shredders and all that. We have, it's available here. We just got to get it. So we're feeling that pressure from the government. But I think the key here is, as we develop as you guys develop new technologies and get technologies from the various national labs and so on, and really extracting these minerals, how do we, what's the priority? Like what minerals is a higher priority, palladium or platinum? And how do you navigate through like all of this shredder material and prioritize exactly which kind of critical materials you want? I think that's number one. Number two is we're just now figuring out the whole battery cycle. And I know I've got my colleague from Total T-Show here, Angela, here somewhere. She can speak pictures. Can speak to that environment of, okay, they're going to be taking batteries and shredding them and doing things with them and all these different critical electrical elements of the vehicle and processing them. And they have their own challenges in trying to figure out, okay, we're getting the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium, we're getting all these out of the battery, but what about all these other things? So they have processes that they're developing and building as well. So, and I think if you look at a general shredder versus a battery shredder, there's a lot of differences in what those entail, like in the processes that are involved and the sensitivities, different environmental concerns, for example, in a battery as opposed to general shredder, for example. So anyway, like I guess the point is, like, we have to attack the problem. We have to attack where that technology is, and very specifically those kinds of battery tech, and working with building R&D technology to help separate those materials out, in particular in batteries and magnets and other things. I know I kind of talked in circle a little bit there, but I think it's really specific for that particular type of operation of batteries and technology shredding as opposed to generic, auto shredding, because it's going to be built in such a way that's targeted to being able to address all these kinds of materials.
Thank you all for being here. I think it's great. It's a great conversation. One of the things that I truly appreciate is the recognition that recycling doesn't happen in a straight line, that there's other players involved. You mentioned the IRA. I think that's great that they've already been involved. Their recycling looks a little different than ours. They're part of our group, of course, but whether we're dismantling vehicles in our yard to remove a bumper, or we're shredding these vehicles to try to recover these products, I think one of the important things to remember is that technology is emerging, and our industry is undergoing a bit of a renaissance at this point. Optical sorting and AI technologies have started to root in this business, and they are emerging. Adoption is slow to happen, and it takes extreme amount of fiscal resources for us to be able to put these in our facilities. My point is that as we move closer to this, I think we all want to understand what this timeline looks like as all this starts to made up. Processing plastics using technology to do it seems like a much more sensible process. Letting equipment do this versus human hands having to dismantle vehicles and take components apart. Letting our machinery do it is a better way to do it. But I'm concerned that those timelines don't mate up. So I'm curious, when do you see this maybe all starting to take hold in this country versus what you're seeing in Europe or other areas?
I get to, I'll take a stab at it. I'll take a stab at it. That's okay. Well, I think, first, I think it's important for us to recognize that we have same questions as you just expressed. And we have been working, Ellen and I and Dan and others have been working with DAPR, with the Durable Automotive Products, Plastic Recycling. So we're looking at plastics specifically, but what we're working within that community is American Chemistry Council, the Automakers, some of the national labs, including Oak Ridge. We are collaborating and actually working towards what we're calling a 5 to 10 year plan to sort of have these conversations with you guys, with ARA, and with other people around that supply chain to figure that out. Because we don't have the answers, we have options, but we haven't figured out what that 5, 10, 15, 20 year plan looks like to be able to address these global pressures. So I think the answer is we don't know, but we know we need to have a lot of conversation to figure it out. So yeah.
The one thing we do know is about the European regulations, right? So we expect them to go into law this year, and they have stated that 6 years after entry into force is when they will require the 15% recycled plastic content. And of that 15%, 3% of that content should be from end-of-life vehicles or closed cycle content. And because we are a global company, there will be vehicles that we produce here and export there, as well as ones that are produced in the region. And obviously, we don't want to have a completely different supply chain or vehicle design from one region to another. We have that timeline, which is 6 years from now. And then additionally, just from pressures of our customers, they expect this. And many automakers have talked about and put out publicly their own targets for how much recycled content we will have in our vehicles in a specific timeline. So those are out there. As well, Toyota has targets, we have targets. All of the car makers talk about what sustainability actions.
And that's partly why I asked the question earlier about timeline, right? So if we're talking about a new car model can sometimes take 5-6 years before it goes to market. And we're talking about an EU directive that's going to become implemented in 5 to 6 years. And when we say 3%, that doesn't sound like a very big number, but trust me, it's millions and millions of pounds of plastic that's going to have to be coming from end-of-life vehicles. And what we know from those of us who are already capturing some of the plastics from ASR and utilizing it into programs is it doesn't weigh very much, right? Like by pound or by volume, this stuff takes up a lot of space and does not fill up our trucks with nice heavy weights like we like when we go down the road. So it is very, very difficult to make money in this business. Extremely difficult, especially when no one wants to pay a premium for the product on the other end. And trying to make it any color, you know, like cars come in many colors, not just black, even though Ford was onto something. When we wanted it all black. It is hard, but the time is now. We have to figure these things out now. We have to be tracking and putting the mechanisms in place. We have to be experimenting with the AI. I mean, if you haven't played around with AI yet, please do so, right? You'd be amazed if you take a picture of just a scrap pile and you ask Claude or ChatGPT, whatever your AI favorite flavor is, to tell you what it estimates the weight is. Just do that as an experiment. It's amazing how close and how accurate it is, and even how accurate it comes up with what materials might be found in that particular pile. Because I'm just nerdy enough to do those kind of questions and tests, and then check against our validated data. It's amazing. So the future is here now. We have to be leveraging it and utilizing it as much as possible so that we can stay advanced and as cutting edge as we've always been. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of going to go to Dan because during your conversation, you did something that was pretty interesting. You talked about 50 lobbyists at the states and that type of thing, and being a trade organization. I'm kind of curious, over the years, have you seen a shift of your lobbying efforts from a federal level to a state level? Was it always the way it is, or can you give me some color on that if you don't mind?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Stuff gets done at the state level, stuff does not get done at the federal level. So that is where we have spent most of our resources in terms of advocacy and lobbying has actually been at the state level. Because that's where things get done. You know, there's a lot of bellwether states, it's not just California where other states will follow. So when we see an issue arise in the states, you know, trying to nip that in the bud as quickly as possible, or, you know, understanding the goal of that state or what the legislator is trying to do. We spend a lot of our resources are at the state level.
Have you seen a shift? I mean, has it always been that way? Have y'all always advocated that way, or has it been a shift?
There's probably been a little bit of a shift, but we've been, since I've been part of the organization, and that's going back 8 years before we even, this organization formed from a merge, most of it has been at the state level. Now, there has been times where the federal government has worked more cohesively, so there's been more effort that we've been able to put there, but it has been a lot of the activity at the state level, so that's been, you know, at least since I've been here. Yeah.
All right, well, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and I want to make sure we can all end on what next steps are. Do you want to talk about where would you like to see us go next? What is your call to action for everybody in the room?
Yeah, I think this is, I think Mark said this is, you know, a step in the broader collaboration. I think there's a lot of opportunities for the auto industry to learn from you all, and you all to learn from the auto industry, and working together, both on advocating, but actually developing policy that works for both sectors. So.
Great.
Yeah, agreed. And you know, on top of that, you know, we realize as OEMs, as car makers, we have a job to play here now. Like it used to be, we could just have our own, we could be in our own little silo, make parts and make cars, and everything's great. You guys do your thing, everything's great. But you know, whether it's regulatory pressure or the right thing to do or whatever, you know, we now have a need to have that conversation with this community so that we can be more effective at delivering better products to the consumer and also that help the environment at the same time, but also delivers and a final point that I think is really important for all of you to recognize that we as automakers, especially here in the US, we want you to be able to make a penny or make a dime on things. We want you to be able to be profitable because that's sustainable. Like if we over-regulate like they do in Europe, you know, no disrespect to Europe's efforts, but if you force government, you know, oversight, that isn't necessarily sustainable. But if we can build towards the potential of being profitable, you know, through development and research and capabilities within y'all and with all the different, you know, value chain plus or minus from you guys, and that makes a penny for you guys, then that is sustainable, and that's what we need to get towards. So yeah, I think that's one challenge I would extend to you guys is to find what's that next penny that I can make. How can I extract that a little bit more out of that ASR, or do X and do Y, you know, to help make yourself a penny, because that makes that more of a stable supply chain for us. We look at you guys now as suppliers, right? You guys are suppliers for us. We are dependent on you. And so we're hoping that you guys continue to lean into those technology developments.
What you said. Well, actually, I think like opening up this collaborative discussion and conversation is super valuable because there are certain things that we can't do in a silo. There are certainly things that we're going to each pursue as independent companies to make that dime. But then there are other actions that we need to do as a community and to work together to make sure that everyone continues to make that dime and that we can figure out the trade-offs to ensure we can do it efficiently and at cost so that our customers don't need to pay more. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who say that they will pay more, when the wallet comes out, they're not paying more. So,
especially if there's a cheaper option. There's still a competitive environment. Well, thank you so much for all being here. I think this was a great conversation, and they will be sticking around. So if you want to meet them or have questions for them, come and check them out.
I also want to thank all of you because this has been an incredible conversation, and I know it's just the start and continuation of conversation we need to continue to have because you're our customer and our supplier. I mean, it's really, you're so critical, the automotive industry is so critical to all of our success. And I think you can see by the show of folks in this room, and again, you have the bulk of the volume that's handled in our industry here in this room, that we really want to work with you. And I just want to emphasize a couple of things. First of all, we also have the leaders of CARI, the Canadian Recycling Association, in the room as well. This is an integrated supply chain. We were just, Andy and I were up in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago now for their annual meeting, and this was a topic of conversation actually. So it's definitely a topic within the whole North American supply chain. And as a matter of fact, one of the conversations that we're also having is Mexico. And so it's not just the technical issues, it's also the policy issues that you raised this. And we'd love to work with you also on the discussions with the Mexican government. We're starting to have conversations with the U.S. Commercial Service in Mexico City, and we also want to connect with the Mexican authorities. We have a challenge in that there's no CARI or ReMA in Mexico right now, but we do have members in Mexico. So we're trying to figure out how to organize them and get them at a point to help with this issue as well. So would love to talk to you about that. And I want to thank all of you. Again, this is a continuing conversation. And please come to Shredders in about 13 minutes when all of this conversation will continue. So thank you.